Ah, indie 3D animation. It sure has become quite the phenomenon in the last decade or so, and it's pretty easy to see why. Working in the field of animation is oftentimes a childhood dream for so many people, especially those who grew up questioning how exactly their favorite animated movies were made. While 3D animation traditionally was an extremely expensive process that could only be done by big-name studios like Pixar or DreamWorks, since it required big computers and a lot of rendering time, technology has advanced massively over the decades, and nowadays, the tiny cell phone you carry in your pocket just straight up outperforms the typical type of computer that Pixar used back in the 90s. That is, unless you're still rocking the old low-tech flip phone. I'm also trying to go a little bit more analog. Stops the addiction, you know? Now, of course, with the dramatic leap in tech and availability of free professional quality 3D animation tools such as Blender, Unity, Unreal Engine, alongside a drastic expansion in the accessibility of 3D animation tutorials and guides online via free services like YouTube, the animation scene has become so much more accessible than ever before. And the number of professional 3D animators and people employed in animation continues to grow every year. And this is of course great news for fans of animated films, as nowadays, generally more talent is working in the industry than ever before. But as with all things corporate, there are only so many jobs to go around, and the industry is extremely competitive, especially in these years with recent layoffs and studio shutdowns. Even though new animation studios continue to rise and old studios expand, animation is a limited field, and oftentimes the hardest thing for an aspiring animator to do is find a job. And the same is true of writers and other creators as well. And on the big scale, the companies behind these animated films can be toxic to work for as well, with us having records of studios like Disney and Pixar allegedly leveraging threat of layoff to pressure employees into long hours of crunch. That crunch has also been a continuing trend in the likes of Sony Pictures Animation, anything VFX related, especially in connection to Marvel, and even over at DreamWorks, they're outsourcing all the animation work for their latest movies. Animators, though they can fight like hell to keep their dream job, can't really stop the corporate machine from turning, and no matter how hard they fight, sometimes they are just simply let go, regardless of legendary status like being the one to revive the sequel to Pixar's Toy Story. After the release of Inside Out 2, which, mind you, was a widely successful animated movie, Pixar reportedly laid off 14% of its staff, with plans for even more future layoffs as well. This is just a continued trend and is absolutely baffling to me to see, since this movie did well. I mean, who is gonna make a successful future Pixar film without the animators? And don't even get me started on bloody well AI animation work. And you gotta imagine, if these layoffs are coming after the creation of a super successful film, one of the biggest animated movies of last year, I can't imagine what happens after the release of an animated movie that bombs. For example, the recent box office disaster that was Disney's Wish. I can't fathom what morale must have been like in that office when the online backlash to that movie came about, and the executives certainly couldn't have been happy about it. But even still, animation is still a dream job, and to the point of this whole video, the field of 3D animation has dramatically expanded in scale from belonging to just a few mismanaged corporations to something much more democratized. While creating premium content in film and TV is expensive and competitive, creating content for platforms like YouTube has roughly no real barrier to entry other than time, skill, computer power, and internet access. Oh, and I guess electricity bills, sure. Kinda hard to animate without being able to turn the lights on. I don't know how good the food breaks are for a corporate animation job, but I presume it's not that great either, so I guess you have to pay for your own food and water too. But with the entire landscape of animation completely changing before our very eyes in practically 3 decades, and especially seeing the likes of giant corpo animation spheres really going through the ringer, perhaps maybe now more than ever, we could actually go on to say that this is the rise of indie animation. YouTube in particular has become the space for these kind of indie projects to shine, because though creating premium quality content is possible on this platform, really any video made in any way can blow up as long as it resonates with people. I mean, look at me. I just started off by making an analysis of a Pikmin trailer 12, 13 years ago. And somehow it's brought me here. I don't know how I got here either. This is why, and yes, I am about to say this as a real sentence, a traditionally crafted show such as The Amazing Digital Circus, lovingly put together as it is, can blow up on the platform alongside the bombastic Gmod insanity that is Skibidi Toilet. That's still getting a Michael Bay movie adaptation, by the way. Both of these projects fall under different parts of the indie animation umbrella and exist outside of the scope of something that would be tried by a typical mainstream animation studio. Still, both shows have found different audiences in a way only possible on a platform like YouTube. Creating something like these projects is a risk that most major studios would be unwilling to take, especially when major streaming services are known for shuttering serialized 2D animated projects like Infinity Train or The Owl House. Even shows attached to famous creatives like Alex Hirsch of Gravity Falls fame aren't safe since Netflix cancelled Inside Job. Actually, I kinda get that one. The show was all about the shadow government, and there's no way Netflix's higher-ups aren't part of the Illuminati. Inside Job was probably just exposing too many of their secrets, you know? Inside Job was an inside job, is what I'm trying to say here. So when beloved shows like these get canned, how can something like Skibidi Toilet expand to become a global phenomenon and apparently get a movie adaptation? Because of course it can! That said, Skibidi Toilet actually isn't doing something particularly new, and I'm kinda sick of looking at it. Gmod and Source Filmmaker animation have existed for a very long time, and these sort of low-budget machinima shows aren't even a particularly new direction for indie anyway. Speaking of machinima, companies like the recently resurrected Rooster Teeth pioneered this model well before YouTube. Starting out in the early 2000s with low-budget machinima shows like Red vs. Blue, and eventually putting out more serialized animated shows like Ruby, Rooster Teeth started from a small team consisting of no animators and worked themselves up to being a large animation company that was eventually big enough to be bought by Warner Brothers. They made it into the mainstream. Oh yeah, and then they were promptly driven into the ground under poor management by Warner Brothers, but hey, Warner Brothers hates animation, I guess. But it really is a marker of how animation is going in these times. I think a genuine part of this kind of cycle is that indie animation is able to simply take risks that major studios cannot given the lack of overhead. And this, I truly believe, is what makes the indie scene so exciting for so many people. It's actually original. Indies are what have been driving the recent rise of adult animation and the perceived target demographic of 3D animation shifting away from being just for kids, while yes, on occasion, a major studio will put together something brilliant and well-received with an adult audience in mind, for example Netflix and Riot's Arcane, but this is the exception rather than the rule. Want to make a Western show with Pokemon-like robots? You'll have to go through a ton of pitching to even be considered by a major animated studio, and you might have some of your ideas pilfered or stolen during the rejection process. In that case, why not just make it yourself? Bam! Mech West exists. This is a genuine indie show you can see on YouTube for free right now. It's nice, classical, family-friendly, and surprisingly, not made by a mainstream studio. Want to make a zany and colorful show based on classic liminal computing that is aimed at an adult audience and full of dark undertones? You know what I'm describing here. It's The Amazing Digital Circus getting you covered right off the bat on that. We love technological existential dread, sprinkled in with all sorts of lighthearted goofiness. It might be on Netflix now, but that show still stands as positively indie. And in fact, this deal could be the biggest marker of where indie can go from here. Rather than being absorbed by a massive mainstream studio, they can instead make a deal for platforming themselves and running off on their own rules, because indie is where a lot of the power is now. And they don't have to go Netflix. You've got the sister show from Glitch Productions in the form of Murder Drones. Want a dark, twisted, dystopian film noir-inspired world with robots and monsters? Autodale is for you. On the 2D front as well, there are shows like Hell of a Boss that exist, again, another serialized indie show aimed at an adult audience. Have I seen some pretty young kids with Has-Been Hotel or Hell of a Boss merchandise who have seen the show? Yes. Is that incredibly age-inappropriate and possibly a crime against humanity? Also yes. But this isn't the fault of indie animation, just a growing pain of animation expanding beyond being seen as just for kids. It's the parents' faults. Hey there, thank you for making it to the halfway mark of this video. Come and subscribe since you've made it this far. We'll be doing more video essays consistently through the year, and clearly you've been enjoying it. Anyway, back to the second half of our video essay on the rise of indie animation. Even 3D shows made by big studios aimed at children are generally getting darker. A sort of fan-favorite example of this is some of the arcs from Lucasfilms' Clone Wars, which deals with incredibly heavy themes and politics. So, what's the similarity here between all of these different indie shows? Why is the indie scene expanding so dramatically? Well, I think it really comes down to a switch in distribution methods. Indies, as mentioned earlier, have a home on open and accessible platforms like YouTube. It's the reason that places like Newgrounds used to be the home of this stuff, even though most of the interesting content has shifted over to YouTube in the modern day. These free platforms make the barrier to entry really low, which means it's easy to build an audience and also build up your own skills without needing the formalities of it all. However, on YouTube, you're in some ways competing against every other video on the platform, debatably. While some truly exceptional indies can do massive numbers thanks to the algorithm really promoting it, see for example the explosive success of Amazing Digital Circus, and then there are some other shows that get bogged down by YouTube's competitive nature. Maybe that's something worth exploring for another video someday, why some indies, don't have as much attention as they should. I've got some thoughts about it for sure. While there are tons of barriers that prevent more indies from popping off, and the biggest one is exposure, major studios have the benefit at least of tons of media attention alongside contracts with distributors like streaming platforms and movie theaters that simply indies have to do all on their own somehow. In fact, it's this legal corporate management side of things that may very well be the hardest part of being indie where things are truly DIY. Somebody involved ends up being basically a small business owner whether they like it or not. Again, look at me, I just wanted to talk about bloody well Nintendo games, and now I've had to create a limited company to make my taxes not crazy extortionate. It's just how life goes sometimes. Indies tend to prefer the sustainable serialized TV show model with multiple installments instead of the big budget single release model as well, and there are a few reasons for this. First, it's relatively easy to publish content for free on platforms like YouTube or on your own website compared to having a full release in theaters or streaming platforms, which require negotiations with the theaters or platforms themselves on some level. They aren't going to host you on their platform if they don't know you exist. On top of this, releasing multiple shorter length episodes on YouTube can be far more sustainable for a small studio anyway, since it's consistent content to come back to for subscribers rather than one big mega video most people will just click away from. It's all about building an audience using the algorithm and your viewers. You gotta hack their brains, you see? There's a real ebb and flow that the likes of the big animation bigwigs don't quite have to deal with. Sort of. I mean, they still have to have, debuts, one movie out and hope it gets some buzz like Pixar did. But still. And this isn't even to say that indie shows can't be in theaters. In fact, there have been multiple indies shown on the big screen before. RWBY made it to theaters multiple times, for example, though that happened particularly through its studio merger with Warner Brothers, which I guess kind of just makes it mainstream corpo anyway, but you get the idea. And what we've seen in several years past is the acquisition of an indie studio by a corporation ends up really dragging the indie into the world of, well, corporate. And this new overhead then typically strips them of the benefits of being an indie in the first place. Maybe they might get more funding, but now they have their corporate owner to think about, which is why more recently, indies have really cracked the code for how to generate a ton of exposure and revenue without having to rely on getting bought out and controlled. They found that corporate distribution is great, but not outright ownership. To that end, we see shows like Amazing Digital Circus on Netflix and Has Been Hotel on Amazon Prime. These shows get increased exposure there, and the streaming company knows what they're getting into by providing simple access to this material. If you're looking to put Has Been Hotel on your platform, you know exactly what you're getting into, and your acquisition of the rights to stream the show isn't going to change anything about what the show itself is or isn't without the consent of the creators. Unless, they'd sign some dodgy contract. At the end of the day though, the easiest way for an indie show to retain the essence of what has made a huge uptick in indie success recently is to stay indie. and to stay true to the vision of the creators. Oh yeah, and be good content too, that's fine. Being high quality really helps. But regardless of what path brought them to the animation field, there's a real solid chance that most animators started out independent anyway. Maybe they got their start making fan animations of some of your favorite shows or games. Or maybe they scribbled down their ideas on a napkin, building a world from stains and then putting the rest together brick by brick, pose by pose. Maybe instead they were inspired by studying how things move, on the screen and in real life, or how graphics evolved over time. Maybe these dreamers were hooked by the behind-the-scenes videos packaged with the DVD releases of big-budget Pixar or DreamWorks films. Maybe they worked hard into getting into one of these companies before going their separate ways and striking their own path. Maybe they've always had a natural talent for storytelling and want their stories to be heard. Or perhaps they just started off making a bunch of random crap when they were 13 on Newgrounds. There are so many reasons people get inspired, get into animation and make the things they want to make. But no matter what, people had to start from somewhere. And if they're publishing the things they're making as they go along, the place for publishing that so it can be seen is YouTube and other social medias, the likes of which simply didn't exist in the 90s. And considering we're now seeing all sorts of these major bigwigs having massive business layoffs and problems, maybe pulling back and sticking to the simplistic, making stuff for yourself with the accessible tools you have within you, could be rising to the point that it even rivals the bigwigs these animators were once heralding they wanted to become in their dream scenario. Whether it becomes a full rejection of the mainstream, reaching up to their heights to be swallowed in like the past, or simply making good deals and keeping them hands off, I genuinely think we're coming to a real boom of indie animation, from both a business perspective and from just the refreshing nature of seeing original stories at a time when corporations want to be so risk-averse that all they can come out with is remakes and sequels. I think we're only at the cusp of indie animation having its real soul, and it's a story that's been going for almost to the anniversary 3 full decades. 1995 to 2025. And it is the democratization of content making on YouTube that truly is the reason we are getting many more indie surprises in the years to come. Sure, for every successful indie, there's probably a failing one too. One that never quite gets off the ground or is just buried by the algorithm. That said, YouTube still is a key platform that helps indies expand the animation medium's limitless potential for storytelling. In fact, I'd probably say it is the key that has unlocked the indie revelation that we've experienced over the past decade and are experiencing proper now. And I, for one, am so excited to see where it goes from here. Every time Disney pisses me off, I can have a breath of fresh air when something indie comes out and shows how to do it right for once. For now though, I'd best end it off there. My name's been Daz. Thank you very much for reaching the end of this essay. Do tell me your thoughts on indie animation and give me suggestions for shows. MechQuest was one I was actually emailed about a couple of times, so I went and checked it out. But give suggestions. Let's hear about some actual refreshing animation at a time when we're surrounded by Disney sequels and the like. Ice Age 6 and all that. And for now, I'll be seeing you in a little bit.